Good evening, everyone. My name is Shane McElroy, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Glanbia Ireland webinar this evening on managing and recovering grass deficits following the long period of dry weather across most parts of the country, and particularly the east of the country and the Leinster region. So while there's been some rainfall in some of the areas over the past week or so, some local areas have very little rain, and that's caused an increase in the grass deficit significantly in some areas, with very low grass growth rates now being seen. We have a great lineup of presenters for our webinar this evening, and I know everyone's going to get a lot of valuable information and insights into the situations that have arisen on our farms and the actions that can be taken, most importantly, to stay in control of feed budgeting on your own farms to keep production on track. The format of our webinar this evening is to have 4 short technical presentations from our subject matter experts within Glanbia, and then we'll have a 15-minute question and answer session. I'd like to encourage each of you on the call today to submit your questions, and we'll endeavour to go through as many of those as we can in the Q&A session at the end. This evening's webinar will be recorded and will be available afterwards to all participants. So we'll run till 8:15 this evening, 45 minutes, and the presentations will be approximately the first 30 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So I'd ask you to text your questions in as you think of them to 087 147 8161, and that number will be on the slides as we go through. So as you'll see from the agenda on the screen, first up to present to us this evening, we have Martin Ryan, who will take us through the recent survey that we've carried out on over 500 of our farmers across the Glanbia area, and this will give us great insights into the realities of the feeding situation from our farms across that area that's been quite significantly affected. Following Martin, then Maeve Regan will take us through the various feed deficit scenarios that we're seeing and that you're seeing on farms, and will take us through the solutions that are available to fill the gap with the various feed sources that are available for that. Next up, we'll have Willie Darmody, who will discuss the straits and the specialist feeds that we have available to meet the needs of individual farm scenarios. And finally, Paddy Dempsey will take us through the use of fertilizer to maximise grass growth rates now that moisture has, or hopefully will soon be returning to most areas. And you know, Paddy makes a very good message. We need grass to feed the cows, but we need to feed the grass as well, and that's the purpose of the fertilizer. So just to say it again, I'd encourage you to get involved in the conversation this evening by sending in your questions by text message to 087 147 8161 with any questions you have regarding your own farm scenario and or concerns that you have, and we'll put these to our specialists during the Q&A session. And just when you're texting in, you might let us know what county you're from, and we'll try and cover off questions from up and down the affected areas. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Martin, and Martin will bring us through the results of our recent farmer survey across the Glanbia area.
Good evening all, and thanks for joining us this evening. I suppose just to put this into context, the data was collected on 522 farms and completed on the 8th of June, and that's what we call the baseline survey. But we've also added to that in the intervening period to look at where the trends have changed and what has actually happened since. So what I'm going to do first is maybe just to call out what the summary might be from the first compilation. And I suppose basically the first thing we looked at is how much silage was left from the previous year. And unlike 2018, there was quite a substantial stock on most farms. While it averaged 20 days, there was a range from 14 to 28 days across the counties. Obviously, a bit more variation within farms. The second thing we looked at then is taking into account how much first cut was ensiled and any products taken out. How did it compare with a normal silage season for most people? And an average deficit there of 13%. That would equate to about 12 days winter feeding on farms. But there were some Leinster counties where the deficit was as high as 27 days, so it almost cancelled out any reserve that was there from the previous year. 47% of suppliers were measuring grass, in other words 53% weren't. Our average growth rate at that point in time on the 8th, which was last Monday week, was 48.8 on average, a little bit below where it would have been on the pasture-based farms. And of course, the important thing is it has fallen by about 14 kgs in the week since then. Average farm cover was just at about 600 with large variation. I think the number of days grazing ahead of the cows was 11, but again with big variances. The average concentrate feeding rate across farms is 3.99, so we call it 4 for all intents and purposes. And one where there was massive variation then was on silage feeding. On average, 33% of all suppliers at that time were feeding silage, and at average 10 kgs fresh wheat per day. But in the worst affected counties, that number was as high as 70%. So just maybe with that background, if you look at the graph here, which represents the baseline on the 8th across those 522 farms, the first thing that stands out is massive variation. So counties in orange are the ones with, I suppose, a deficit that almost cancelled out any surplus they had from the previous year. And on 48% of the farms since the 8th, in other words, from the 8th to the 15th, we lost another 45 days silage because it was fed out to cattle or fed out to cows in that period. So I think that's the big call-out period there. The other thing, I suppose, that was really, really surprising is there is a critical level of farm cover, which we classify as 500, below which you significantly impede grass growth or potential for recovery. Excuse me. And on the 8th of June, there was 7.5% of the farmers in that space. But over the following week, which is over the past last week, a further 81% of farms lost cover or reduced in cover. So we reckon there was nearly 25% of all farms in that space by last Monday morning. Okay, some were starting to get a little bit of rain at that point, or over the weekend. But that was a significant number. And the big call out here is that actually impedes the potential for recovery or speedy recovery, the speed of recovery. So just moving on from there then, the other issue which we looked at was the number of days grazing ahead of the cows. Now normally in the month of June, we'd be hoping to have an average of 14 days ahead of the cows. On the 8th, we had an average of 11. And that dropped by 3 across the following week into Monday morning last. So we were down to 8.2. So quite a significant eating into grass reserve there and lowering level of cover. The other piece, I suppose, was just there was quite a significant variation in the concentrate feeding rate. And obviously the drought affected counties like the Kildare, Dublin, Meath, they were all in the higher category. And in the south, the Cork, Waterford, South Dips, they were all in the lower areas. But that feeding rate has increased by about a kilo per head across the board on average in the past week. Now, the other thing that actually varied massively in the first iteration of the survey was the percentage of farmers feeding bale or silage. And obviously, 3/4 of them that were feeding silage were actually feeding bales. But the areas like Kildare, Laois, Louth, some of those had right up to 70% and over of farmers feeding silage at that point in time. But if I took the average right across all of the counties, it was at 33%. And over the course of the following week, then it rose to 51%. So that brought us right up to last Monday morning. One of the questions then that we also asked what the preference was in terms of bridging the gap. So the figures here are the average across the 522. So this represents what people felt would be the most practical for them based on what gap they perceived they had. And the first one there is concentrates. 14% felt they could solve their issues with concentrates, 4.8% with straights, 6.7% with silage, and a very large 58% felt that it would take a combination of concentrates and silage to fill the gap they had, whereas 12.1% felt it would be straights and silage, with a very small proportion looking at buying silage or anything like that. So just moving on from there then, I think, and getting to look at how we manage our way from where we are back into where we'd like to be. And the first issue was growth rate. When we completed this initial baseline survey on the 8th, we had an average growth rate of just over 40 on these farms. Again, a bit lower than the pasture-based figures, but nevertheless, the variation was again the big call out here, with an awful lot of farms well below what their demand figure was. The demand figure based on where their concentrate feeding rate was and their stocking rate was at around 54 kgs per hectare at that point in time, leaving them with a significant gap. But more importantly, in the week that followed, that gap got bigger by 14 kilos per hectare, or about 3.78 kilos per cow at the average stocking rate. So that was a further gap that needed to be bridged, if you like, in that regard. So just to kind of put this into context in and look at it from your own perspective in your own farm, we normally look at an average cow, and we regard that average cow as a 575 kg cow requiring 18 kilos of dry matter with an output of 25 or 6 litres to be between those two figures for a spring calving herd. If you increase live weight, if you have larger type Holstein cows, every 100 kgs requires an extra kilo of dry matter, and every extra 2 litres of milk also requires that. And then, depending on body weight, if you want to improve body condition by 250 grams a day, you need another kg of dry matter. So it's important to customise and base your own situation on those metrics, and particularly taking into account your stocking rate here. So that's the important thing. Every farm is different, and growth rates are different, and so on. So I just want to contextualise that a little bit more now here. And this is really based, first of all, the upper assumptions are based on the average across the board. So the stocking rate was around 3.7 livestock units per hectare. And with the feeding rate that was there on the 8 at 3.99 kilos, that would give you a demand between 50 and 55, depending on cow size per hectare. In fact, right across a few counties there, you had a 30 kilo growth rate. With a 30 kilo growth rate, you can really only add or provide to the cows 8 kgs a day of grass in that diet in terms of dry matter if you want to prevent your situation from deteriorating. And that leaves you with a gap of 10 kgs to be filled from a combination of concentrate, silage, straights, whatever. But in some of the Kildare, Dublin areas in particular, and parts of Carlow and indeed Loudoun and part of Meath, we had growth rates down at 20 kgs. In that kind of a scenario, in order to recover quickly and manage this as best you can from an overall economic perspective, you need to cut down the grass allocation to about 5.4 kgs, because grass grows grass. And if you don't do that, you'll actually just delay your ability to recover when the opportunity comes. So that leaves you with a huge gap there of 12.6 kilograms to be filled from a combination of perhaps concentrate, silage, straights, and maybe even a bit of alfalfa in a scenario like that. So, because one of the things we found, anywhere growth rates were low, those were also the areas where silage was in deficit in first cut, and it was also where silage was already being fed. So you were starting to ease into next winter as well. So there was then taking kind of in the middle of our area, and this one actually is a Kilkenny example. On Monday there, the growth rate was 29, a high stocking rate farm, and given you a demand of 63, and the average farm cover was right down at 405 kgs, and the feeding rate was just 3.5 kgs at this point in time. So we're rapidly eating into reserve here, and that left us with a gap per cow per day of 11 kilos of dry matter. So critical to fill that, to prevent that from deteriorating, so that when rain comes, you get the quickest possible recovery. And so the other piece we looked at was right across the supply base, and there's massive big variations in here between suppliers. But normally we'd be looking for post-breeding and post-peak a lactation fall off, if you like, of about 2.5% per week maximum to keep persistency in the lactation. That's what your kind of standard figure would be, or your standard target. So without getting into the detail of this, there's maybe a couple I could call out. That if I really analyse that, in counties like Carlow, over 70% would have exceeded that in the last 2 weeks on a weekly basis, well, exceeded 2.5%. Whereas if I went up to County Cavan, where they didn't have any issues with grass or drought, you'd find that figure was down at 30%. And if I actually went to South Tipperary, which would actually have calved quite early, they would actually have zero fall in that period. And there's a big economic cost to losing lactation persistency this early, because for a lot of farmers, there's 175 to 200 days for those spring calving cows to go yet. So really, I think the big call-out message here, and the last week has added to the variability, because some people have got rain, some people have not. But it's a real story of variability here. Johnstown Castle, for example, over the weekend got 13.6. Dunsany County Meath was recorded at 2.3. And I'm just going to call out the Oak Park one here at 3.8. Now, since Monday, they actually got a further 2.2, so they're up at 6 mls of rain for the month of June to date. Now, the mean for Oak Park for the month of June would be 60. So we're a long way off there so far without getting significant further rainfall. And that figure would have been, in last year it was 55 for the month of June, and if I go back to 17, it was actually up at 90. So that's just to highlight. And you can see Ballyhayes up that Cavan country there only got 0.2. So big variations. And last night again we had more rainfall in some areas and zero in more. So I suppose just looking at, apart from the rainfall variation, the grass cover variation ranges from under 400 to right above 700. The number of grass days ahead of the cows is ranging from 4 to 20 right across the spectrum today, which is massive. The grass growth is ranging from 15 in the driest areas right up to 60 in some of our southern areas. And if I took the lactation decline on an area basis, as I mentioned, South Tipperary, for example, had zero decline for the last 2 weeks, and some areas of Carlow-Kilkenny are exceeding 5% per week. So all of these responses, need to be customised, and the farm situation needs to be taken into account. So I suppose all we can do is use the advice that's coming after me, and if you have any questions there, text them into the number at the top of the screen, and it helps actually maybe just to indicate what area you're in when you're actually doing that. So we'll move it on to Maeve there next now, and Maeve will actually look at some of the actions that can be taken at individual farm level. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. And just a quick reminder for any texts that want to come in with specific farm scenarios to get them texted into the number that's on screen. We're going to quickly run through some farm scenarios at the moment and some timely tips and advice around grassland management. At the moment, the age-old saying that you cannot manage what you don't measure springs to mind, and this is especially important at the moment when our ideal grazing situations start to disappear on farm during the main growing season. So it is important to manage and measure, and it'll be a few short weeks and months until we're stepping out pits, counting bales, etc., and doing a forage analysis for the winter ahead. So we should look at measuring grass the exact same case that you're actually just measuring what feed you have available on farm. In regards to grass growth and grassland management at the moment, you'd hear a lot of talk about rotation length and extending or holding the rotation length. The target at the moment is to extend or hold at 24 to 25 days. That means grazing a maximum of 4% of the platform per day. It's important at this point as well just to note that if you are extending rotation length, where you extend it greater than this to your 28, 29, 30 days, you will start to lose quality. So there is a fine line between extending and holding the rotation and then extending it too far and losing out on quality. Martin talked about average farm cover earlier and the importance of it. Average farm cover at the moment when grass growth is declining should not fall below 500 kilos of dry matter per hectare. If we look specifically at pasture-based Ireland data at the moment, those herds that fell below the 500 kilo mark compared to those that held average farm cover above it, they've restricted their growth by about 30%. To put that into figures, that's the equivalent of between 15 to 20 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. So a significant amount of grass being lost out there when you're not intervening, getting in early, putting a plan in place and holding average farm cover. For those of you who are not measuring grass and you're trying to kind of see where average farm cover is at, if you're turning cows into pre-grazing target heights of 1100 or less, your 9-10 centimetres of grass or less, your average farm cover will be falling below 500 kilos of dry matter per hectare. The key advice at the moment is to get out and walk the farm twice per week. It helps focus the mind on what feed we have available to the grazing mob. And again, achieving residuals of 4 centimetres to make sure that we have quality in the next rotation, because we can't afford to waste grass at the moment. Wasting feed and wasting grass, it's the same thing. You have to clean out those paddocks to 4 centimetres, get them growing again, and you have high quality grass in your next round. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about cows being quite content and not moving through covers as quickly as you'd expect. Grass dry matter is quite high at the moment. If you look just specifically at the research herds that are monitoring dry matter, it's ranging from 19 to 21% dry matter. So that don't underestimate when given an allocation to the herd what cover you have or what grass is there available in the allocation. The priority at the moment when we talk about grassland management is to decrease your demand in order to match what growth rates you're getting on the platform. Most areas will have already done this if they're kind of experiencing this soil moisture deficit for a longer period than others. They'll have already brought back in additional ground into the milking platform in the form of silage ground. They'll have removed surplus stock off the platform to decrease that demand. That'll be removing your heifers, young stock, beef animals, cull cows, etc. off the platform. And then when we get down to the feed and the nutrition side of things, your first port of call should be to increase your parlour supplementation. Where the deficit exceeds this, introducing a forage buffer, ideally in the form of high quality surplus bales. And where you think forage availability over the winter might be a concern, using straights there to increase or to stretch out your fodder availability. And for those areas that have been lucky enough to get rain and where you're seeing grass growth start picking up, it's important to recover average farm cover. Where in instances where that average farm cover has been run down very low and it's below the 500 kilos of dry matter per hectare mark, it's important to keep your demand quite low or below your growth in order to build that average farm cover back up. And when things get back to normal, keep in mind your typical targets at the moment would be your pre-grazing heights of 1,400 kilos of dry matter per hectare and your cover per cow being 160 to 180 kilograms per livestock unit available. I suppose, again, to reiterate what Martin had said previously, seek tailored advice. Get the right advice that suits your farm. We talked about different cow types having different scenarios and plans in place, different stocking rates on a very practical level on farm. Every farm will be different when we compare parlour facilities or facilities for feed in the yard, headspace availability, ingredients or different forage types available, labour, farm setup, fragmentation. So it is important that you get the tailored advice that suits your specific farm setup. Again, to back up what Martin was saying on milk output, we can't afford to compromise milk output at the moment. When we talk about milk output and your typical decline of being 2.5% post-peak in milk output, if you compare that with a decline of 3%, you're looking at a lost income for the rest of the lactation for a typical 100 cow herd of €6,330. In the more severe cases or incidences where that milk volume decline, when we look at is at 4% compared to your 2.5%, it's a lost income for the entirety of the rest of the lactation for a 100 cow herd of €17,500. So you can't afford to let that milk volume decline happen. And when we look at milk volume declines, things to keep in mind is ensure that the cow's dry matter intake capacity is being met and our energy requirements for maintenance and output are also being met. Martin went through some scenarios then where your growth should see how much of a deficit or your growth rates will dictate how much of a deficit you have to fill. A very simple calculation to keep in mind at the moment is getting your growth rate, dividing it by your stocking rate and seeing how much grass you have available. So if we take a growth rate, for example, of 40 kilograms per hectare per day, and you're stocked at 3.5, you'll see that you'll have just over 11 kilos of dry matter grass and grazed grass available to the cow. So that's a handy calculation to have in mind. And then obviously if we take a typical cow with an 18 kilo dry matter intake per day, we can fill that 7 kilo dry matter deficit with a blend of concentrates via the parlour and high quality bale silage. Where that deficit is greater or your grass availability becomes lower, and we're talking about 8 kilos of dry matter available to cows, again, filling that deficit with silage and parlour concentrates, but also including some soya hulls there in order to stretch your fodder availability and not run down winter forage reserves. And in the really severe cases where we're talking about only having a quarter of the diet or 5 to 6 kilos of dry matter intake coming from grazed grass, filling that deficit obviously then with soya hulls or alternatives. It's important as well where in these more severe cases, ideally 50% of the diet would come from a forage, and where that straights inclusion or that concentrate inclusion becomes quite high, using a forage with a high buffering capacity to make sure we maintain room and function to a healthy level. It might come in the form of alfalfa hay. Again, another thing to note, soya hulls here can be fed in one feed up to 4 kilograms. So some simple practical tips to keep in mind. And when we talk about straits, and we're going to look at some more park research data here that was conducted during the drought of 2018. And they looked at what straits performed best in relation or in comparison to parlour supplementation. When we take a standard parlour supplementation during a drought period of 6 kilograms per cow per day, with the remainder of the diet coming from half grass or half grass silage, and we compared it then to the typical mid-lactation feeding rate during the summer of 2 kilograms of concentrate via the parlour, and then the additional 4 kilograms came from either soya hulls, beet pulp or palm kernel. As you would expect, parlour concentrate performed the best, holding milk yield, milk solids output per cow per day in kilograms, and body condition score to the best point. Body condition scores are a really important one at the moment. Compared to 2018, we're a lot earlier and we're closer to the breeding season. Pregnancy maintenance should be a high priority on farm at the moment. And as we're all aware, body condition score and fertility traits are highly correlated. But then when we look specifically at what straight to use and what straight performed best in comparison to a parlour supplementation, the straight that performed best was soya hulls when we looked at milk yield, milk solids yield per cow per day, and body condition score in relation to parlour supplementation. And I suppose the key from this slide to take is that the ingredients that you use to fill the deficit or the gap are very important on what you will get back in the lactation. If you look, for example, at palm kernel versus parlour concentrate supplementation, there's a difference there of 3 kilograms per cow per day in output or total volume output. And if we're looking at a typical spring calf and herd with 175 days plus left in the lactation, that 3 kilograms, when a cow falls off the lactation curve, it's quite difficult to get her back up to where she should be. So that 3 kilograms will have a significant effect on the economics for the remainder of the lactation period. So again, when you are filling the deficit, the ingredients that you use to feed the cow are extremely important. Willie, I'm just going to hand over to you now and you might run through some specific gain advice.
Yeah, thanks, Maeve. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'll talk a little bit about the farm services that are available and the diets that are available as well. So I suppose, firstly, it's very much farm specific. You know, we're seeing this neighbouring farms have totally different situations. Some farmers got moisture, other farmers didn't. So each specific case is different. So the advice and the messaging has to be specific to each farm for that purpose. Then we have a number of on-farm services. We do diet formulation, we do forage analysis, we do feed budgeting. Please contact your local business manager or your local branch manager. Have the conversation. There's plenty of help available. If you need them to come out and walk the farm and socially distance in the process, they will do that. They'll assess your grass covers, they'll assess what grass is growing, and then they'll put various scenarios and options in place for you for there. So the whole thing is to be proactive, early intervention. As pointed out earlier, the sooner you get in, the sooner you make those decisions, the sooner you come out of this thing overall. And the more you'll help performance and avoid those major setbacks that can occur if there's a major deficit in intake. So we have a number of products available. While we have a very, very broad range of products, our key products at the moment are a product called Lactation Sustainer 16 and Summer Sustainer 14. We also offer 12% protein feeds. We've got 13% protein feeds. We've got 18% protein feeds as well. But these are the two key products. These products were available during the 2018 drought. They performed exceptionally well. They're well trialed. They're well tested. So these are the two key ones. Both have native cereals inclusion. They have a high level of digestible fiber. They're maize-based. They both have a product called Aglan included that helps performance and reduces methane emissions, and both have magnesium and minerals included also. Summer Sustainer 14 is a 2.5 kilo feed rate product, and Lactation Sustainer 16 is a 3.5 kilo feed rate product. And it's important to bear in mind the maximum feed rates. The maximum feed rate on Summer Sustainer 14 is 4 kilos. The maximum rate on Lactation Sustainer 16 is 6 kilos. So, for example, if you're at 4 kilos at this moment in time and you're feeding Summer Sustainer and you think you're going to have to feed a higher level of concentrate over the next few weeks, well, then your next order is for Lactation Sustainer 16. So, in summary, there's plenty of help there. Teams are very experienced. They've been comprehensively trained. They'll give you all the help you need. And I'll hand it over to Paddy Dempsey from here. Thank you for your attention.
Willie, thanks for that introduction. So to now, Maeve and Willie have really focused on feeding the cow, and what I'm going to talk about is actually feeding the grass, and it's going to come through in terms of fertilizer applications. So as we look at fertilizer applications, the key priorities today are to prioritise putting fertilizer out on fields that have not got fertilizer in the last month, especially any fields or paddocks that are green and have a green base that haven't got burnt. They want to be getting a bag of something like a supernet product with nitrogen and sulfur. Or where you can use phosphate or phosphorus on your nutrient management plan, if you're allowed to use phosphorus, you will get a far better recovery of the root in the plant if you can use a compound fertilizer, something like Richland, pasture sward or cut sward with a combination of NPK and sulfur. The sulfur will give you far greater efficiency for the nitrogen, and you get far quicker uptake in the plant, and you get a recovery better. The more nutrients you can throw at that plant, especially for root development and root recovery. Potash in particular, where you can put it out, use what potash you're allowed at this time just to get that plant growing again, get the root developed and get water uptake and get the plant into a quick state of recovery. The one thing about putting out fertilizer now is you need to be just conscious of the weather forecast. In terms of showers and rainfall, you're going to end up with a lot of runoff if you get these thundery downpours where you get 4 and 5 mil of rain in a couple of hours, and you've all kind of seen the forecast. It's all for thundery storms and thundery showers, so we need to be very mindful of runoff. And just where you're putting out fertilizer, you need to be conscious of maybe watch the forecast, wait for those heavy showers to pass before you go with fertilizer, because the best response will be got from putting out fertilizer where there's a bit of moisture available. There's probably no great benefit from putting out fertilizer on burnt grass. As you've seen from Martin Ryan's slides there on the rainfall, some parts of Carlow and Laois in particular have gotten very limited rainfall. So you just need to tailor your fertilizer advice to what's happening on your farm. And finally, in terms of looking at some recommendations for silage ground, there's still silage fields that have not got fertilizer since the first cut was taken off, and they're the absolute priority at this stage, is to get a fertilizer out on those fields. Again, to be mindful in terms of putting fertilizer on bare ground, if you're going for a second cut of silage, you need to just stop and think, if the weather forecast is for thundery downpours, that you don't put out 80 units of nitrogen on a bare field, and then you get a heavy thunderstorm and you end up with fertilizer runoff and maybe the risks of pollution and that. So the recommendation there would be to go with approximately 40 units now and 40 units again in 2 weeks' time, just to split that application. In areas where we are getting plenty of moisture, there's probably still the opportunity to go with some slurry on that ground. And at this stage in the year, I would say all slurry should be spread with low emissions equipment. So that's your trailing shoe or your dribble bar, just to avoid the loss of nutrients from the slurry you're putting out. In places where we have gotten a bit of recovery, but you haven't got the slurry out, you do still need to be mindful of putting out a compound fertilizer, and you need to be conscious of putting in what the crop is going to take off. So if you take a second cut silage now, you're probably going to take off about 70 to 80 units of nitrogen, 12 to 16 units of P, and approximately 80 units of potash. And also on that crop, you do need to be conscious again of putting out sulfur. So you've got key products there, something like your cut sward, which is 24, 2.5, 10 with sulfur, or your silage elite 21, 210 with sulfur and the bale. And those products work really well for second cut silage. And I'm just conscious that we're running slightly over on time, so I'm just going to put in this here in terms of talking about lime. Where we are getting a bit of moisture and where rain is falling, there is probably an opportunity now maybe to cover 20% of your farm with lime, if lime is a requirement on your farm. It's one nutrient that's totally underrated on a lot of farms, and you get great response from putting out lime where lime is required. But again, just bear the weather in mind, put it out where you're getting a forecast of rain, where it'll be washed in. It'll be ideal time to put out the lime. Then finally, just in summary, on fertilizer applications, the key thing to remember is it's about the right product at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place. So use sulfur, I would say, in all products, because every farm at this point in time is in a soil moisture deficit. So you will get better uptake of nutrients by using sulphur in your products. And where you can use a compound fertiliser, I would say use a compound fertiliser. And then finally, just on the slurry, where low emissions slurry spreading equipment is available, there's still the option of putting out slurry where you're getting plenty of rain. So at that, I'm going to just hand back to our chairperson, Shane McElroy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paddy, and thanks to all of our 4 speakers for the great information there on where things are at on the farm at the minute and across our area, and more importantly, the actions that can be taken to get in control of the grass deficit this summer. We've a lot of people joined us on the webinar this evening, and thanks to all who've sent us in questions for our speakers. We've an awful lot of questions in by text message and across a number of topics. We'll do our best to get through them. I don't think we'll get through them all, but we'll get back to you individually if we don't get to some of them. Just a reminder for the text number is 087 147 8161, and just let us know what county you're from in the message as well. First question to come in just as we actually kicked off this evening, it's from Wexford, and it's one for yourself, Maeve. What's the, and it's actually linked to 2 other questions that have come in from Carlo and Kilkenny, so maybe give them 3 questions to you at the same time, Maeve. What is the maximum amount of maize silage that can be fed? And that particular texter from Wexford has a 32% dry matter maize silage with 35% starch. And then sort of linked to that, how much protein do I need in the concentrate when feeding a high level of beet and or maize silage and low protein straights? So maybe just those 2 together if you can, Maeve.
And it'll be very dependent on the deficit that you need to fill, number one. And when we talk about crude protein levels, it'll be dependent on how much of the diet is taken up by a low protein feed or an alternative feed to graze grass. In regards to maize silage using as buffer, it's always important to remember it's high in energy, it's quite low in protein. So where you are using it, it needs to be balanced correctly, especially things like low protein straights, maize silage and beet. And they need to be balanced correctly to meet the cow's dietary crude protein requirements. And in regards to using maize as an inclusion in the diet, if you look at research data, especially in those more indoor and partial TMR situations, maize silage works quite well at a 50-50 or a 60-40 ratio blend with grass silage as a buffer feed. But again, it'll be very dependent on the deficit that you have. So in that case, I would say calculate what deficit you have to fill, reach out, get the right advice, and see what feed you have, because you want to see how much feed you'll have and calculate it into your winter fodder budget as well.
Great stuff, Maeve. And just I suppose typically with grass being the main part of the diet and that being high in protein, typically we're trying to balance rations down for protein, but this year we're unfortunately trying to balance them upwards because of the other feeds being much lower in protein. And one of the things that comes as a requirement of derogation for the nitrates piece for farmers for this year and going forward is the requirement to not go above 16% crude protein. So we've been in touch with the Department of Agriculture on that, because there are a small number of farms that do need to go above 16%, and there's no issue with that. We'll get any farmers in that situation something in writing to show that that is a requirement on the farm, and that keeps them compliant from their derogation requirements. Just on, Willie, to a question for yourself. We don't have the county here, but someone who's already feeding 6 kilos in the parlour, and they look like they're going to be short on winter feed is what they're saying. They want to know, should they go with a midday feed and save silage, or introduce high quality bales? So should they save silage given that they're looking like they're going to be short, or should they go feed the bales?
Yeah, I'd say if they're going to be short, I'd say it's a case of maybe feeding some surplus bales initially, if they've got some, and then as a second option, it's a case of bringing in some soya hulls. And they can go higher. I mean, if they need to go to 7 or 8 kilograms in the parlour, we have concentrates that'll do that as well. But I'd say if you're scarce in silage, like it's hard to eat into next winter's silage. You know, you just don't like eating next winter's feed. Use up the surplus bales if they're there, and then your next option is to bring on soya hulls. And you can feed soya hulls after the milking. You know, if they're getting 3 kilos in the parlour, there's nothing wrong with putting in 2 kilograms after the milking in the morning, or 2 kilograms of soya hulls after the milking in the evening. It's just, it may not be feasible to do a midday feed.
Yeah, no, that's great, Willie. Thanks very much. Martin, just one for yourself there. When will it be safe to take out the poor quality second cuts? So, you know, like second cuts are behind and first cuts were a bit behind as well. But if your second cut is heading out, what's the best time to go get that cleaned up?
I suppose there's kind of 2 scenarios. First of all, there's some areas which it's actually not actively growing. in which case I take it out absolutely as soon as I can. If it's headed out, I suppose the objective is to take it out as early as possible and start again. Particularly, you know, on the basis that it looks like weather is broken and we will be getting more moisture. So that gives us a chance to restart the growing process. In taking it out, I suppose one of the things I'd caution here is, you know, when we actually go to cut it. Let's say we get rain in the next few days on that particular crop and you get a bit of a surge in nitrate uptake into it. You will have a fairly high nitrate content in it when you go to inside it, if you do that. So you need to probably wait for a couple of fine days to let it lower that and raise sugar, and then probably give it a wilt for 24 or 36 hours as well to make it a lot easier to preserve. But you're better off taking it out and starting again than you are leaving it there, because it certainly won't improve in quality.
Yeah, no, that's great, Martin. Just to keep moving with the questions there, one for yourself again, Maeve. A farmer from Kilkenny, current growth, and there's another farmer from Meath as well, who's a cover per cow at 205, which is a bit scary, but Kilkenny farmer here who has a current growth rate over the past week of about 25 to 30. He's estimating with a demand of 60, 3 kilos in the parlour already. He's going to run out of grass within the week. What should he do?
Intervention is key here in this kind of scenario. So if we're on about matching demand to growth, so if you're only growing 25 or 30 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day, and your demand is double that, you ultimately have to halve your grass demand on the platform, which would be substituting in half the diet in the form of and grass silage, and or a straight of choice, which would be soya huds. But again, in this case, you've run down average farm cover. If you don't step in and intervene, you're going to run out of grass fairly quickly.
Yeah, no, that's great, Maeve. Paddy, a question in from Wexford there. You mentioned lime there towards the end of your presentation, but the question had come in actually earlier on as we started yours. Lime and slurry interaction. So anyone who wants to spread slurry and spread lime as well, what's the best approach there?
So if you're spreading lime, it's best to leave at least a week to 10 days between slurry and lime application, because you'll end up losing the nutrients out of the slurry. And the same thing applies there when you're spreading fertilizer, that you wouldn't put fertilizer and slurry out within a week of one another. And another thing just to be conscious of, people talking about spreading lime, when you talk about putting lime out before second cut silage, it's really important that you don't spread lime when there's green leaf available and there's a risk of that lime coming back in with the second cut silage. So it needs to be on the bare stubble if you're spreading it before second cut silage, but ideally spread it after second cut silage. And just something on lime that people tend to forget, there's no limitations on when you can spread lime outside of silage cutting season. You can spread it right through the winter season if the ground conditions allow. Ground conditions are really the only thing that will restrict you in spreading lime, so there's no issue there.
Yeah, no, that's great, Paddy. Willie, just a question in there from Leash. Why is there so many contrasting views on the use of palm kernel? And then another question that's in from Leash as well, actually, where does alfalfa fit in?
Yeah, there's various views on the palm kernel expeller. All right, I suppose the view that I would take very seriously is the trial work that was done in Moorpark on it. You know, where they fed palm kernel versus concentrate versus soya hulls versus beet pulp, and the distinct differences there between concentrate, balanced dairy feed, and palm kernel was a 3 kilogram reduction in milk when the palm kernel was used. Also, I mean, there was a 0.2% reduction in milk protein, which is very, very substantial. And there was a significant, almost 0.2 of a kilo on milk solids. So it's really, in terms of performance, it's how you look at performance. If you want performance, well, then you got to look at a fully balanced, properly formulated concentrate. As regards alfalfa is an excellent feed, a highly palatable feed, a high energy feed, high dry matter. Some farmers refer to it as concentrate in a bale. I mean, it feeds like concentrate, but yet it has a very, very high buffering capacity. It helps intake. It helps milk protein. It helps milk yield. Very, very safe feed. Very easy to feed 4 or 5 kilograms of it. Animals will eat it quite quickly, and they'll go off and go graze and settle in at that. So I think alfalfa is a key solution provider where people are getting very, very tight on grass, and maybe they're quite tight on the amount of silage they have available as well.
Oh, that's great, Willie. Maeve, over to you, and I'm keeping these questions coming at you, folks. A question in from Kildare. farmer seeing a drop in milk volume on his milk collections over the past week. What can he do to keep that from happening?
And we're seeing a bit of this at the moment in the more severely affected areas where you see a drop or decline in milk volume. Again, act early. You can't afford to lose out in volume, and it's very hard to get a cow back up to where she should be typically on the lactation curve once she's dropped off. I would ask the question in regards to dry matter intake capacity being met. Is she getting enough feed in? Are you estimating what grass you have available to her? Again, have you enough energy going into that diet? Is there high quality feed going in? What kind of quality silage have you available? Those kind of questions to make sure you're meeting her requirements. And again, that your diet is properly balanced for crude protein level as well. So it's important to evaluate your diet if you're seeing milk volume drop. So that's from a nutrition point of view anyway.
Thanks, Maeve. And just to take a veterinary perspective on it as well, just if there's significant milk drops, just for everyone to be aware of, especially in areas that there's been some rain, maybe a week ago or so, that parasites are literally jumping out of the ground at the minute. And one thing to be wary of is lungworm and the impact that can have on the animal system and cause a significant drop in milk all of a sudden. So just ears open for the cough and take action on that with treatments as needed. Martin, over to yourself. Just a question from your own county, from Tipperary. Will the big bursts of rain that have come in some areas, and I know Tipperary has had a good bit of rain in some parts, will that drive nitrogen uptake and grass growth? Obviously it will. And what could that do to fertility?
I suppose there's a few things that happens when you get that rain, and we did get it in Tipperary and parts of it. We were up at 35 millimetres there last weekend. There'll be quite a bit of nitrogen in the ground fixed with high temperatures and things over the last number of weeks. So you will get a fairly rapid uptake of nitrogen in that scenario. Obviously, it'll help grass growth, but it'll also probably be at a higher level than photosynthesis will handle in terms of converting to true protein. So that will actually drive the amount of nitrate going into the cow, and that will be reflected in milk ureas and so on. Normally, milk ureas for the last few weeks were running down at single digits. Some of them were down at 10, 11, 12, and even down as low as 8 and 9. And that has no real impact on cow health. But normally, if you get above 35, there's a distinct possibility that you could cause embryo mortality, particularly where the embryos are younger than 35 days in the cow. And in 2018, we actually saw in September, post-rainfall, milk ureas shooting as high as 50. So there is a potential there for risk. But if the energy content from lower protein feeds is reasonable, it tends to burn off some of that.
That's great, Martin. And just conscious time, we're running a slight bit over, but I just want to take two more questions. Willie, to yourself, a farmer has asked just about the maximum feeding rate. He's got feed in the bin that's only for feeding rate of 2.5 kilos. What's his max rate on that? I think it's 4 kilos, but can he go over that? Are you with us there, Willie?
Yeah, Shane, that's a very, very important one, because we're very conscious of maximum. We don't like iodine getting into milk powders or getting high in milk powders. So with a 2.5 kilo feed rate product, where the CalMag minerals are in 2.5 kilo, the maximum intake there is 4 kilos, and that's a very critical one. Now, if the feeding level has to go over that, well, then the next step is to a lactation sustainer, which is a maximum feed rate of 6 kilos. So it's important that people adhere to the maximum feed rates, and generally speaking, on a 2.5 kilo product, it's 4 kilos, and on a 3.5 kilo feed rate product, it's 6 kilos. So you've got plenty of flexibility within that overall.
Yeah, and just important then to not go over that from particularly an iodine point of view, and I'm thinking milk quality here, because we have to be within specification. So if somebody needs to feed a higher rate, then ideally they buy the right product and feed it at that rate. And just while we're talking milk quality as well, just this time of the year, it's always just keep an eye on the thermodurics, and it's something that has raised its head as it does in the summer. And particularly we're looking at higher ambient temperatures in the parlour, but the dust that's coming in on cows at the minute, and that dust also contains bacteria, and those thermogenic bacteria are what gets seeded into the system then and can cause other issues. Just the last question to yourself, Paddy, and it's come in from a farmer in Bagenstown in Carlow. We spread canned fertiliser 6 and 3 weeks ago. We've had very little rain in that time. How much nitrogen is still available in the soil for growth?
Again, you have to say, Shane, it's very much area specific. If he has been getting growth rates of maybe between 20 and 40, he's probably using a unit a day out of that as opposed to 2 units a day. So depending on the level of fertiliser he applied, you at least want to be allowing 1 to 1.5 units a day when it's been taken out of that over the last number of weeks.
Yeah, no, that's great, Paddy. And it just depends, as you say, how much he's used. So that's great. Folks, I just need to bring it to an end this evening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in the webinar and by participating by submitting questions to the conversation. For all the questions that came in that we didn't get to, and there are a number of them there, we'll respond to you individually, and one of our technical team will be in touch. So just to remind everyone, there's a recording of the webinar will be available shortly on Glanbia Connect, and if you want to share it around with your friends that you know that haven't been able to dial in this evening. In summary, what's really important is not to kick some of today's feed deficit issues into next winter. And it's much more cost-efficient time to resolve that deficit now when cows are outdoors than kicking on the problem into next winter when forage will be short. As we know, every farm is different, and for bespoke solutions for your own farm situation, get in touch with your Glanbia branch or business manager. There's lots of support there to assist you through this challenge. There's also lots of technical information available on Glanbia Connect on our website and on our weekly e-zine that you can sign up for as a weekly update by email as well. So I hope everyone has got some really useful information from the webinar this evening, and we're looking forward to providing you with more technical updates by webinar in the near future. So to close off our webinar, thanks again to our presenters, to all of you for participating in the webinar this evening. Stay safe on farm, look after yourselves and each other, and have a good evening. Thank you.